Sometimes the things we dismiss as worthless hold far more value than we ever imagined. Sometimes the people we cast aside prove much stronger than we thought possible. When two greedy brothers cheat their younger sibling out of his rightful inheritance, leaving him with nothing but a barren acre and a giant rock, they believe they've won. Elias is forced to build a shack atop that worthless stone, mocked and forgotten while his brothers prosper on fertile land. But a loyal dog named Buster refuses to stop digging at the rock's base. What he uncovers will turn 3 lives upside down and prove that justice has its own way. Could the most worthless land actually be the most valuable? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Samuel Garrett died, the sun rose blood red over the Three Forks Valley, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and gold. He had been a cattleman for 47 years, weathering droughts, harsh winters, and the slow decline of the open range. His ranch, the Double G, sprawled across 1,200 acres of prime Montana grazing land, bordered by the Stillwater River on one side and the foothills on the other. It was land worth fighting for, land worth dying for, and Samuel had done both in his own way. His 3 sons stood around his deathbed in the main house, a sturdy log structure that Samuel had built with his own hands back in 1891. The room smelled of medicine, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of decay that accompanies a long illness. Dr. Henderson had left an hour before sunrise, shaking his head and murmuring that it would not be long now. The old man's breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one seeming like it might be his last. Levi Garrett, the eldest at 42, stood nearest the headboard. He was a thick-shouldered man with a face carved from weather and ambition. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of ranch work, gripped the bedpost with barely concealed impatience. He had his father's square jaw and steely eyes, but where Samuel had possessed a rough-hewn integrity, Levi carried only calculation. He had been waiting for this moment for years, planning what he would do with his inheritance, how he would expand the operation, maybe even buy out the neighboring spreads. Jed, the middle son at 38, stood by the window, pretending to look out at the dawn, but really watching his older brother's reflection in the glass. Jed was leaner than Levi, with a weasel's cunning hidden behind an easy smile. He had always been the clever one, the one who could talk himself out of trouble and into opportunity. Where Levi used brute force and intimidation, Jed used words and manipulation. Together, they made a formidable pair, and they had spent the last 6 months discussing how they would divide the ranch once the old man finally let go. Elias, the youngest at 31, sat in a straight-backed chair near the foot of the bed. He was different from his brothers in almost every way. Slighter of build, with gentle eyes and work-worn hands that bore the marks of honest labor rather than violent ambition. While his brothers had schemed and plotted, Elias had stayed close to their father, helping with the day-to-day operations, sitting with him through the long nights of his illness, reading to him from the Bible and the newspaper. Samuel had noticed this devotion. It had not gone unappreciated. The old man's eyes flickered open one final time. His gaze swept across his 3 sons, lingering longest on Elias. His lips moved, forming words that never quite found voice. Then, with a sound like wind through dry grass, Samuel Garrett breathed his last. The silence that followed was profound. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Levi straightened, clearing his throat with an authority he had been waiting to claim. "Well," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been grief, but sounded more like satisfaction. "That's that, then." Jed turned from the window, his face carefully arranged into an expression of sorrow. "We should send word to Reverend Walsh. He'll want to know for the service." Elias said nothing. He simply sat there, looking at his father's still face, feeling the weight of loss settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He had loved the old man, truly loved him, in a way his brothers never had. To them, Samuel had been an obstacle, a gatekeeper standing between them and prosperity. To Elias, he had been a teacher, a friend, a source of wisdom and quiet strength. "Elias," Levi said, his tone impatient, "you hear me? Go fetch the Reverend." "Let him sit a minute," Jed said, though his eyes held no real sympathy. He was closest to Pa, after all. The funeral was held 3 days later on a clear October afternoon. Half the valley turned out to pay their respects. Samuel Garrett had been a hard man but a fair one, and people remembered that. They came with covered dishes and murmured condolences, filling the yard and spilling into the pastures. Reverend Walsh spoke of duty and devotion, of a life well lived in service to the land and to God. Elias stood between his brothers at the graveside, aware of their impatience even as they bowed their heads in prayer. Levi kept checking his pocket watch. Jed scanned the crowd, no doubt calculating which neighbors might be convinced to sell their land now that the Garrett patriarch was gone. Neither of them shed a tear. After the last prayer and the final handful of dirt, the crowd began to disperse. Martha Henderson, the doctor's wife, pressed Elias's hand and told him his father had been proud of him. Old Tom Breslin, who had worked the neighboring ranch for 30 years, clapped him on the shoulder and said that if he ever needed help, all he had to do was ask. These small kindnesses meant something, but they could not fill the hollow place in his chest. That evening, as the sun set over the valley, the 3 brothers gathered in their father's study for the reading of the will. Clayton Morse, the family lawyer, had ridden out from town with a leather satchel and a grave expression. He was a thin man with silver hair and spectacles that perched on the end of his nose. He had known Samuel for 20 years and had drafted the will personally just 3 weeks before the old man's death. "Gentlemen," he began, settling into Samuel's chair behind the heavy oak desk, "I want to express my condolences once more. Your father was a good man and a valued client." "Yes, yes," Levi said, waving his hand dismissively. "Let's get on with it, shall we?" Clayton frowned, but opened his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of papers. The will itself was written in Samuel's own hand, witnessed and notarized, legal in every particular. Clayton adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The document was straightforward in its opening provisions. Small bequests to various ranch hands and longtime employees. A donation to the church. The cattle herd divided equally among the 3 sons. And then came the matter of the land itself. "To my eldest son, Levi," Clayton read, his voice steady, "I leave the western section of the Double G, comprising 400 acres of prime grazing land along the Stillwater River, including the main house and barn." Levi smiled, leaning back in his chair. That was the best land on the ranch, the most valuable acreage. He had expected nothing less. "To my middle son, Jed," Clayton continued, "I leave the eastern section of the Double G, comprising 400 acres of grazing land and timber, including the east pastures and the logging camp." Jed nodded, satisfied. The timber alone was worth a small fortune, and the east pastures were nearly as good as Levi's riverland. "And to my youngest son, Elias," Clayton read, his voice taking on a note of something strange, something almost like regret. "I leave the northern parcel, comprising 1 acre of land known locally as the Devil's Tooth." The room went silent. Then Levi laughed, a harsh bark of amusement. "1 acre?" he said. "Pa left him 1 acre?" Jed was grinning now, unable to hide his delight. "The Devil's Tooth, no less. That worthless hunk of rock." Elias felt his face flush hot, then cold. The Devil's Tooth was infamous in the valley. It was a massive rock formation that jutted up from the earth like a broken fang, maybe 40 feet high and twice as wide at its base. Nothing grew there. No grass, no trees, nothing but bare stone and thin soil. It was considered bad luck by the local ranchers, avoided by cattle and avoided by people. His father had left him a barren acre and a useless rock. "There must be some mistake," Elias said quietly, looking at Clayton. "Pa wouldn't—" "There's no mistake," Clayton said, and his voice carried a weight that silenced Levi's laughter. "Your father was quite clear about his intentions. He signed this will in sound mind and body, as sound as a dying man can be anyway. This is what he wanted." "Well, isn't that something?" Levi said, standing and stretching. "Looks like the baby of the family got exactly what he deserved." "Now, Levi," Clayton began, but the big man cut him off. No, Pa knew what he was doing. He always did. Elias here gets to live on his rock and think about what he should have done different." Jed stood as well, moving to the door. "Come on, brother. Let's leave the prince of the devil's tooth to his kingdom." They left, their laughter echoing through the house. Clayton remained seated, looking at Elias with something like pity in his eyes. "I'm sorry, son," he said. "I argued with him about this, tried to convince him to reconsider, but Samuel was adamant. He said you would understand in time." "Understand what?" Elias asked, his voice hollow. "That he thought I was worthless, that I deserved nothing." "I don't think that's what he meant," Clayton said carefully. "Your father was a complicated man. He had his reasons, I'm sure of it." But Elias could not hear reason in that moment. All he could feel was the burning shame of betrayal, the crushing weight of rejection. His brothers, who had schemed and plotted and shown no real love for their father, had received everything. He, who had stayed loyal and devoted until the end, had received nothing but a barren acre and a worthless rock. Clayton gathered his papers and stood. "If you need anything at all, you come see me in town. I mean that, Elias." Elias nodded numbly and watched the lawyer leave. Then he sat alone in his father's study as darkness fell, trying to understand how the world could be so profoundly unjust. Outside, he could hear his brothers already making plans, their voices carrying through the windows as they discussed which cattle to sell, which land to lease, which neighbors to pressure into selling. He had nowhere to go. No money. No prospects, just a single acre of worthless land and the clothes on his back. His brothers would not let him stay at the ranch. He knew that with certainty. They had made their contempt clear enough. As the moon rose over the valley, Elias made his decision. If the devil's tooth was all he had, then the devil's tooth would have to be home. He would build something there somehow. He would survive, and maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to prove that his father had not been entirely wrong to have faith in him, even if that faith had been expressed in the strangest way possible. The eviction came 2 weeks after the funeral. Elias had known it would happen, but knowing did nothing to soften the blow. He was packing his few belongings into a worn canvas satchel when Levi and Jed arrived at the bunkhouse where he had been staying. They did not knock. They simply walked in, filling the small space with their presence and their contempt. "Morning, little brother," Jed said, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Come to help you relocate to your new estate." Levi leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You got till noon to clear out. We're converting this bunkhouse into a tool shed." Elias kept packing, not looking at them. His hands trembled slightly as he folded an old shirt, one that had belonged to their father. "I'll be gone within the hour." "Good," Levi said, "and don't think about coming back. You set foot on our land again, and we'll have the sheriff run you off." "Your land," Elias said quietly, finally looking up. "Funny how fast you forgot it was Pa's land." Jed's smile vanished. "Pa's dead, and he made his choice real clear about who deserved what. You want to argue about it, you take it up with God when you see him. Otherwise, get your things and get gone." After they left, Elias sat on the edge of the narrow bed, looking around the room that had been his home for most of his adult life. The ranch had been his whole world. Every post he had mended, every calf he had pulled, Every sunrise he had seen from these pastures, all of it now belonged to men who valued it only as property, as wealth, as power. His brothers would run this place into the ground within 5 years. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name. He finished packing and walked to the stables. His horse, a grey mare named Rosie, was already saddled. Elias had bought her with his own wages 3 years ago, so at least she was truly his. Tied to the saddle was his only other real possession, his dog, Buster. Buster was a mongrel of uncertain heritage, part hound and part terrier, with a wiry brown coat and intelligent eyes. Elias had found him as a half-starved puppy 4 years ago, caught in a coyote trap up in the foothills. He had nursed the dog back to health, and Buster had been his constant companion ever since. The dog whined now, sensing his master's distress, and Elias reached down to scratch behind his ears. "It's all right, boy," he said softly. "We'll figure something out." The ride to the Devil's Tooth took most of the morning. The northern parcel lay at the far edge of what had been Samuel's property, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and across rocky terrain. As Elias approached, he saw the formation rising from the earth like something from a nightmare. The Devil's Tooth was well named. It was a massive spire of dark grey stone, weathered and cracked, towering over the surrounding landscape. The ground around it was nothing but hardpan and gravel, with a few scraggly bushes clinging to life in the thin soil. Elias dismounted and stood looking at his inheritance. 1 acre, barely enough space for a man to turn around. And at its center, this monstrous rock that served no purpose and provided no shelter. His brothers had been right about one thing. This was worthless, utterly, completely worthless. Buster jumped down from the saddle and immediately began sniffing around the base of the rock, his tail wagging. At least the dog seemed unbothered by their circumstances. Elias envied him that simple acceptance. He spent the rest of the day taking stock. There was no water source on the property, which meant he would have to haul it from a spring about a mile away. There was no shelter except for what he could build. The rock itself was too sheer to climb without equipment, but there was a slight depression near the top where wind and rain had worn away the stone. If he could find a way up there, he might be able to construct some kind of platform or shelter. It would be safer than sleeping on the ground, at least. Predators roamed these foothills: bears, mountain lions, wolves. A man alone on the ground would not last long. Over the following days, Elias made multiple trips back to the spring for water and down to the town of Three Forks for supplies. He had a little money saved from his wages, enough to buy lumber, nails, rope, and some basic tools. The townspeople looked at him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Word had spread about Samuel's will, about how the youngest Garrett boy had been left with nothing but a rock. Some folks offered sympathy. Others offered jobs, stable work, fence mending, anything to help him get by. But Elias politely declined. He had his pride, even if he had little else. Building the shack was brutal work. First, he had to fashion a rope ladder to reach the depression near the top of the rock. Then he had to haul up every board, every nail, every tool by hand. His muscles screamed in protest, and his hands blistered and bled. But he kept at it, day after day, working from dawn until dark. Buster watched from below, occasionally barking encouragement or chasing after the rabbits that darted through the brush. After 2 weeks of labor, Elias had constructed a crude shelter. It was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with rough plank walls and a tin roof that he had salvaged from an abandoned homestead. It was not much, but it was weatherproof, and it was high enough off the ground that predators would not be a concern. He even managed to rig up a pulley system to haul water and supplies up and down. The first night he spent in his new home, Elias lay on his bedroll and stared up at the tin ceiling, listening to the wind howl across the rocks. Buster curled up beside him, warm and reassuring. Outside, he could hear the distant howl of wolves and the rustle of something moving through the darkness below. He thought about his brothers, probably sitting in the main house right now, drinking their father's whiskey and congratulating themselves on their good fortune. He thought about the ranch, about the land he had loved and lost, and he thought about his father, trying to understand why Samuel had done this to him. There had to be a reason. Clayton Morse had said as much. But for the life of him, Elias could not figure out what it might be. 2 months passed. Winter was coming on fast, bringing cold winds and early snow. Elias had managed to weatherproof his shack and lay in enough supplies to last through the worst of the season. He had also found work with some of the neighboring ranchers, doing odd jobs and repair work. It was not much, but it kept him fed. The work was honest, and the ranchers treated him fairly, which was more than his brothers had ever done. But the isolation wore on him. The Devil's Tooth was far from everything, and the nights were long and dark. Sometimes, sitting in his tiny shack with only Buster for company, Elias wondered if this was how his life would be from now on, scratching out a living on a worthless piece of land, forgotten by everyone except the dog at his feet. It was during one of these long nights that his brothers came to visit. Elias heard their horses before he saw them, heard their voices carrying across the distance. He climbed down from his perch and stood waiting as Levi and Jed rode up, their faces twisted with mockery. "Well, well," Levi said, looking up at the shack. "Look at what our little brother has built. A palace fit for a king." "Or a crow," Jed added, laughing. "Way up there on that rock like some kind of bird." Elias did not rise to the bait. "What do you want?" "Just came to see how you're getting along," Levi said. "Word around town is you're doing odd jobs, scraping by. We thought maybe you'd come to your senses by now, realize that you don't belong out here." "This is my land," Elias said quietly. "Pa left it to me." "Pa left you dirt and stone," Jed said. "Face it, Elias. He knew you weren't worth anything more. That's why he gave you this worthless pile of rock." The words stung, but Elias kept his face neutral. "If you came all this way just to insult me, you've wasted your time." "I'm not leaving." Levi's expression darkened. "You should, though, because things aren't going so well for us at the ranch. Cattle prices are down. We might need to sell some land to make ends meet, and when we do, we don't want you sitting out here, reminding people of the Garrett name." "What I do on my own property is my business," Elias said. "Your property," Jed sneered. 1 acre of nothing. You're pathetic, you know that. Living up there like some kind of hermit, pretending you matter." They rode off laughing, leaving Elias standing alone in the gathering dark. Buster pressed against his leg, whining softly. Elias reached down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the anger and shame burning in his chest. His brothers wanted him broken, wanted him to give up and disappear, but he would not give them that satisfaction. He would survive, he would endure, and somehow, someway, he would prove that he was worth more than a barren acre and a worthless rock. Winter came hard that year, arriving early and settling in with a vengeance. Snow piled up around the base of the Devil's Tooth, and the wind cut through the gaps in the shack's walls like knives. Elias stuffed rags and newspaper into the cracks, but the cold still seeped in. He burned what little firewood he could scavenge, rationing it carefully, knowing that each piece might mean the difference between survival and freezing. Buster proved to be worth his weight in gold during those bitter months. The dog's body heat helped keep Elias warm at night, and his keen senses alerted them to dangers that Elias might have missed. Wolves prowling below, the approach of severe weather, the rare visitor making their way up the trail. More than that, Buster was company, a living presence that kept the crushing loneliness at bay. The work dried up as winter deepened. Ranchers hunkered down, focused on keeping their own herds alive through the cold months. Elias's savings dwindled. He supplemented his dwindling supplies by hunting rabbits and grouse, though game was scarce in the frozen landscape. He learned to make do with less, to stretch meals further than he ever thought possible. Some days he ate nothing but weak broth and hard biscuits. Other days, he did not eat at all. It was during these hungry times that Martha Henderson appeared at the base of the rock, calling up to him. She had ridden out from town with a basket of food, bread, cheese, dried beef, and a jar of her famous preserves. Elias climbed down to meet her, embarrassed by his gaunt appearance and threadbare clothes. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "you shouldn't have come all this way. The trail is dangerous in winter." "Nonsense," she said briskly, handing him the basket. "My husband and I have been worried about you. Everyone in town has heard how you're living out here, all alone. It's not right." Elias accepted the basket gratefully, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. "I appreciate this more than I can say." Martha studied him with a mother's critical eye. "You're too thin, Elias Garrett. Much too thin. Why don't you come back to town? We can find you work, a proper place to stay." "This is my home now," Elias said quietly. "I won't run from it." "That's pride talking," Martha said, not unkindly. "There's no shame in accepting help." "It's not pride," Elias said. "It's all I have left. If I leave here, if I give up on this place, then my brothers win. They get to be right about me. I can't let that happen." Martha sighed but nodded. "I understand. But promise me you'll come to town if things get too desperate. Promise me you won't let your stubbornness kill you." "I promise," Elias said, though he was not entirely sure he meant it. After Martha left, Elias climbed back to his shack and opened the basket. The food inside seemed like a feast. He shared the dried beef with Buster, savoring each bite, feeling strength return to his limbs. That night, he slept better than he had in weeks, but the relief was temporary. As January gave way to February, the cold grew even more bitter. A series of blizzards swept through the Eeyore Valley, dumping 3 feet of snow and cutting off access to town. Elias found himself truly isolated, trapped atop the Devil's Tooth with dwindling supplies and no way to hunt or forage. The wind screamed through the rocks, shaking the shack until Elias feared it might blow away entirely. He huddled under every blanket he owned, with Buster pressed against his chest, and prayed for the storm to pass. It was during one of these storms that disaster struck. A particularly violent gust tore away a section of the tin roof, exposing the interior to the elements. Snow poured in, soaking everything. Elias scrambled to cover the hole with a tarp, but the damage was done. His bedroll was ruined, his supplies were wet, and the temperature inside the shack plummeted. He spent that night shivering uncontrollably, wrapped in damp blankets, listening to Buster whine beside him. For the first time since arriving at the Devil's Tooth, Elias seriously considered giving up. Maybe his brothers had been right. Maybe he was a fool for staying here. Maybe this land truly was worthless, and he was worthless for believing otherwise. But when dawn finally came, pale and cold, Elias forced himself to stand. He repaired the roof as best he could, dried out his belongings in front of the small fire, and took stock of his situation. He was down to a few days' worth of food. The trail to town was still impassable. He would have to make do somehow. That afternoon, as he was gathering the last of his firewood, Buster began barking furiously. Elias looked down to see 2 figures on horseback approaching through the snow. For a moment, his heart lifted, thinking it might be help. Then he recognized the riders. Levi and Jed. His brothers dismounted and stood at the base of the rock, looking up at him with expressions of mock concern. "We heard about the storm," Levi called up. "Thought we'd better check on our poor little brother." "I'm fine," Elias called back, though his voice was hoarse and weak. "You don't look fine," Jed said. "You look half dead. Why don't you come down so we can talk properly?" Against his better judgment, Elias climbed down. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he knew he had made a mistake. Levi's expression shifted from false concern to genuine malice. "You know," Levi said conversationally, "we've been thinking. This land of yours, it might be worthless, but it still borders our property. We've been talking to some investors about expanding our operation, and having you squatting out here makes things complicated." "I'm not squatting," Elias said, his jaw tight. "This is my land." "Technically, yes," Jed said. "But here's the thing. We're willing to make you an offer, a generous offer considering what you've got. We'll give you $50 for the deed to this acre. That's more money than you've seen in months, I'd wager." $50, Elias repeated, "for land Pa left me in his will." "For a worthless rock," Levi corrected. "Take the money, Elias. Get yourself a fresh start somewhere else. Maybe head to California. Try your luck out there. Anything's better than dying alone on this godforsaken pile of stone." Elias looked at his brothers, seeing the calculation in their eyes. They did not care about him or his welfare. They wanted him gone because his very existence reminded people of their greed, of how they had cheated their own blood. The devil's tooth might be worthless, but they wanted it anyway, wanted to erase any trace of their father's strange generosity. "No," Elias said simply. Levi's face darkened. "No? You heard me. This land is mine. I'm not selling it, not to you or anyone else." "You're being stupid," Jed said, his voice hardening. "We're trying to help you, and you're throwing it back in our faces." "You're not trying to help me," Elias said. "You never have. Now get off my property." Levi stepped closer, towering over his younger brother. "You think you're tough, living up there on your rock? You think that makes you better than us? You're nothing, Elias. Nothing but a stubborn fool who's going to freeze or starve because he's too proud to admit when he's beaten." "Maybe so," Elias said, meeting his brother's glare without flinching. "But at least I can look at myself in the mirror. Can you say the same?" For a moment, Elias thought Levi might actually hit him. The big man's hands clenched into fists and violence flickered in his eyes. But then Jed put a hand on his brother's arm, pulling him back. "Come on," Jed said. "He's not worth it. Let him freeze out here if that's what he wants. Won't be our problem come spring." They mounted their horses and rode away without another word. Elias stood in the snow, watching them disappear into the distance, feeling both triumphant and terrified. He had stood up to them, refused their insulting offer. But at what cost? He had no food, no money, and winter was far from over. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with it, or die with it. The storm finally broke 3 days later, leaving the valley buried under snow, but blessedly calm. Elias, weak from hunger and cold, managed to make his way to town on foot, leading Rosie through the deep drifts. The journey took hours, and by the time he reached Three Forks, he was stumbling with exhaustion. Tom Breslin found him collapsed against the side of the general store, half conscious and shivering. The old rancher carried him to the doctor's office, where Martha Henderson took one look at him and ordered him into bed immediately. Elias tried to protest, but his body had other ideas. He slept for 16 hours straight, with Buster curled up on the floor beside him. When he woke, he found Dr. Henderson sitting in a chair by the bed, reading a medical journal. The doctor looked up and smiled. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said. "You gave us quite a scare." "I'm sorry," Elias said, his voice raspy. "I didn't mean to be a burden." "Nonsense. That's what neighbors are for." Dr. Henderson set aside his journal and leaned forward. "But we need to talk seriously, Elias. You can't keep living like this, another storm like that, and you won't be so lucky." "I don't have a choice," Elias said. "The devil's tooth is all I've got." "Then at least take better precautions. Stock up on supplies before the weather turns. Build a proper stove for heat. Accept help when it's offered." The doctor's voice was firm but kind. "Your father was my friend. I promised him I'd look after you boys if anything happened to him. I'm trying to keep that promise, but you have to meet me halfway." Elias nodded, feeling ashamed. "You're right, I've been foolish." "Not foolish," Dr. Henderson said. "Just stubborn. There's a difference, though sometimes it's hard to see." Over the next week, Elias recovered his strength. The townspeople rallied around him in ways that surprised and humbled him. Tom Breslin donated lumber and nails. The blacksmith, a big Swede named Eric Larson, fashioned a small but efficient wood stove. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house contributed warm clothes and blankets. Even Reverend Walsh stopped by with a box of books, saying that a man living alone needed something to occupy his mind during the long winter nights. Only one group of people seemed uninterested in helping: his brothers. Levi and Jed made no effort to check on him, despite knowing he had nearly died in the storm. When Elias saw them in town one afternoon, they crossed to the other side of the street to avoid speaking with him. The message was clear. As far as they were concerned, he was no longer family. It hurt more than Elias cared to admit. Despite everything, despite their cruelty and their greed, some part of him had hoped they might show even a shred of brotherly concern. But that hope was foolish. Whatever bond had once existed between them had been severed the day Samuel's will was read. Elias returned to the Devil's Tooth in late February, better equipped and better prepared. He installed the stove, which made an enormous difference in the shack's livability. He stocked up on supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and canned goods. He even managed to buy a few laying hens, which he kept in a small coop he built on a ledge below his shack. The eggs were a luxury he had not tasted in months. As the days slowly lengthened and the first hints of spring appeared, Elias began to feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. He had survived the worst winter of his life. He had refused his brother's attempts to buy him out or break him down. He had proven, at least to himself, that he was tougher than anyone had given him credit for. But his brothers were not finished with him yet. In early March, as the snow began to melt, they struck again, though this time their attack was more subtle. Elias learned about it from Tom Breslin, who rode out to the Devil's Tooth one afternoon looking troubled. "I thought you should know," Tom said, dismounting and accepting the cup of coffee Elias offered. "Your brothers have been spreading stories in town, saying you're not right in the head, saying you're dangerous, living out here alone, that people should stay away from you." Elias felt anger flare in his chest. "Why would they do that?" "Because they're afraid," Tom said bluntly. "Afraid that people are starting to respect you for sticking it out here. Afraid that you're making them look bad by comparison. So they're trying to poison opinion against you." "What are people saying?" "Most folks don't believe them," Tom said. "But some do, and it's making things harder for you. Already I've heard that some of the ranchers are hesitant to hire you for work, worried about your brothers making trouble for them." Elias sat down heavily on a rock, feeling the weight of this new betrayal. It was not enough for Levi and Jed to have taken everything from him. Now they wanted to take away his reputation, his ability to make a living, his standing in the community. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "Keep doing what you're doing," Tom said. "Keep being honest and hardworking. People will see the truth eventually. But in the meantime, be prepared for things to get harder." Tom was right. Over the following weeks, Elias found work increasingly difficult to come by. Ranchers who had previously been happy to hire him now made excuses. Even in town, some people began to cross the street when they saw him coming, influenced by his brother's whispers and innuendos. Only a core group of people remained steadfast in their support: Tom Breslin, the Hendersons, Eric Larson, and a few others who knew Elias well enough to see through the lies. They continued to offer work and friendship, refusing to be swayed by gossip. But they were a minority, and Elias felt increasingly isolated. The loneliness pressed on him like a physical weight. There were days when the only conversation he had was with Buster, and nights when he lay awake wondering if he should just give up and leave. He could head west, start over somewhere where the Garrett name meant nothing. But something kept him rooted to the Devil's Tooth. Pride, stubbornness, or perhaps something deeper, a sense that his father had left him this land for a reason, even if he could not yet understand what that reason might be. One evening in late March, as he sat outside his shack watching the sun set over the valley, Buster suddenly lifted his head and began to whine. The dog was staring intently at the base of the rock, his ears pricked forward, his body tense with interest. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, climbing down to investigate. Buster was focused on a narrow fissure in the rock near the spot where spring runoff had washed away some of the topsoil. The dog pawed at the opening, whining insistently. Elias could see nothing unusual, just bare rock and dirt. He tried to pull Buster away, but the dog resisted, continuing to dig and scratch at the fissure as if something immensely important lay hidden there. "There's nothing there," Elias said, though Buster ignored him. Finally, Elias gave up and returned to his shack, leaving the dog to his mysterious obsession. It was probably just a rabbit hole or the scent of some small animal. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to Buster continue to dig below, Elias felt a strange stirring of curiosity. What if the dog had found something? What if there was more to this rock than met the eye? He dismissed the thought as foolish. The devil's tooth was worthless. Everyone knew that. But still, sleep was slow in coming that night, and when it finally arrived, Elias dreamed of buried treasure and hidden secrets waiting to be uncovered. Spring arrived slowly in the valley, melting the snow and bringing green shoots to the grasslands. For Elias, the changing season meant new opportunities for work. Fences needed mending after the winter, cattle needed branding, and fields needed plowing. Despite his brother's efforts to blacken his name, there was enough work to keep him fed, if barely. But Buster's obsession with the fissure in the rock did not fade with winter. If anything, it grew stronger. Every morning and every evening, the dog would return to that same spot, digging and scratching, wearing his paws raw in his determination to reach whatever lay beneath. Elias watched this behavior with growing concern and curiosity. Dogs had instincts that men did not. Maybe Buster sensed something worth investigating. On a warm April morning, Elias decided to help. He climbed down with his pickaxe and shovel, determined to dig out whatever had captured his dog's attention. If nothing else, it would put Buster's mind at ease and give Elias something to do on a day when no work was available. The fissure was narrower than he had thought, barely wide enough to fit his hand. Rain and snow melt had carved it over years, washing away topsoil and exposing the bare rock beneath. Buster danced around him excitedly as Elias began to dig, removing the loose dirt and gravel that had accumulated at the base. He worked for hours, sweating in the spring sun, making slow progress. The rock was harder than granite, resisting every blow of the pickaxe. Several times Elias was tempted to give up, but Buster's insistent barking drove him onward. The dog seemed to know something Elias did not, and after months of isolation and disappointment, Elias was willing to trust that instinct. By noon, he had cleared away enough debris to expose a larger section of the rock's surface. And that was when he noticed something odd. The stone here looked different from the rest of the formation. It was darker, smoother, with a faint metallic sheen that caught the sunlight at certain angles. Elias ran his hand over it, feeling the cool, almost glassy texture. This was not granite or sandstone or any rock he recognized from years of working the land. He kept digging, and Buster kept digging beside him, both of them working with renewed energy. As the afternoon wore on, they exposed more and more of this strange stone. It seemed to form a vein or layer running through the rock, perhaps 3 feet wide and extending deep into the earth. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Elias's pickaxe struck at an angle and dislodged a chunk of the surface layer. The piece fell away, revealing what lay beneath. For a moment, Elias could only stare, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The light caught the exposed surface and blazed with a brilliance that made him squint. It looked like metal. Smooth, lustrous metal that gleamed silver and gold in the dying light. Elias dropped his pickaxe and knelt beside the opening, touching the surface with trembling fingers. It was metal, definitely metal, but unlike anything he had seen before. The surface was patterned with strange geometric designs, almost crystalline in structure, and it felt dense and heavy, much heavier than ordinary iron or steel. Buster barked triumphantly, as if to say he had been right all along. Elias laughed, a sound that was half mad with disbelief. He had been living on top of this for months, thinking he owned nothing but worthless rock, and all along there had been metal, valuable metal, hidden beneath a layer of hardened dirt and weathered stone. But what kind of metal? And how much of it was there? These questions chased themselves around Elias's mind as he continued to dig, exposing more of the strange surface. By the time darkness forced him to stop, he had uncovered a section roughly 4 feet across, all of it showing that same brilliant metallic sheen. That night, Elias could not sleep. He lay in his shack, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. If this was what he thought it might be, if this was valuable ore or mineral deposit, then everything would change. The Devil's Tooth would not be worthless anymore. He would not be worthless anymore. But he needed to be sure. He needed expert opinion, someone who could tell him exactly what he had found and what it was worth. The problem was that the moment he revealed his discovery, word would spread. And if word reached his brothers before he could secure his claim, they would find a way to take it from him. He knew that with absolute certainty. The next morning, Elias rode into town with a sample of the metal wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked into his saddlebag. He went straight to Eric Larsson's smithy, knowing that the big Swede knew more about metals than anyone else in the valley. Eric was working his forge when Elias arrived, hammering out horseshoes with steady, powerful strokes. He looked up and smiled when he saw Elias, setting down his hammer. "Elias, my friend, what brings you to town?" "I need your expertise," Elias said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I found something, and I need to know what it is." He unwrapped the sample and handed it to Eric. The blacksmith took it, frowning, turning it over in his large, scarred hands. His expression changed from curiosity to surprise to something like awe. "Where did you find this?" Eric asked, his voice low. "At the Devil's Tooth. It's part of the rock itself. There's more, much more. I think the whole formation might be made of it, underneath the surface layer." Eric carried the sample to his workbench and examined it under better light, testing its weight, scratching it with various tools, even holding it over a flame to observe how it reacted to heat. After several minutes, he looked up at Elias with an expression that was hard to read. "Do you know what this is?" Eric asked. "No, that's why I came to you." "This is meteoric iron," Eric said slowly, "mixed with nickel by the feel of it. High-grade meteoric iron. I've only seen it once before, in a museum in Stockholm when I was a boy. It's rare, Elias. Very rare. And if you're telling me the whole rock is made of this, then you're not sitting on a worthless piece of land. You're sitting on a fortune." Elias felt his legs go weak. He gripped the edge of the workbench to steady himself. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without proper analysis. But yes, I'm certain. This came from space, Elias. Fell from the sky thousands of years ago. The indigenous peoples would have considered it sacred. Scientists would pay handsomely just to study it. And if there's as much as you say, mining companies would pay a fortune to extract and refine it." "How much is it worth?" Eric shook his head. "I cannot say exactly, but enough to change your life, enough to make you a very rich man." For a long moment, Elias could not speak. All those months of hardship, all the mockery and isolation, all the nights wondering if he should give up and leave, and his father had known. Samuel had known what the Devil's Tooth really was. That was why he had left it to Elias, the son who would stay, the son who would endure. "You cannot tell anyone about this," Elias said urgently. "Not yet. If my brothers find out before I can secure my claim properly, they'll try to take it from me." Your secret is safe with me, Eric promised. But you need to move quickly. You need to file proper mining claims, get legal documentation, maybe hire a geologist to survey the site. These things take time and money. I don't have money, Elias said. Then we'll figure something out, Eric said firmly. You helped me when I first came to this valley, gave me work when no one else would. Now it's my turn to help you. We'll go to Clayton Morse. He's a good lawyer and a fair man. He'll know what to do. Elias nodded, feeling hope surge through him like electricity. The Devil's Tooth was not worthless. He was not worthless. His father had believed in him enough to leave him something precious, something that required patience and faith to discover. And now, finally, he understood why. Clayton Morse listened to Elias's story with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career navigating legal complexities. When Elias finished and showed him the metal sample, the lawyer sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers, thinking. This changes everything, Clayton said finally. But it also makes things more dangerous. Your brothers will challenge your claim if they find out. They'll argue that Samuel didn't know what he was leaving you, that the will should be invalidated or revised. It won't hold up in court, but they'll tie you up in litigation for years if they can. What should I do? Elias asked. First, we need to secure your mineral rights. The land is yours, which means the mineral rights are yours too. But we need to file proper claims with the territorial office. That costs money. I have a little saved, Elias said. About $30. That's not enough. Filing fees, surveyor costs, assay reports. You're looking at $200 minimum, maybe more. Elias felt his hope deflate. $200 might as well be $2,000. He had no way to raise that kind of money. Eric, who had come with Elias to the meeting, spoke up. I can lend him some. Maybe $50? I can contribute as well, Clayton said. Another $50. Samuel was my friend. I'd like to help his son. I'll find the rest somehow, Elias said, though he had no idea how. Over the next week, word quietly spread among Elias's supporters about his need for funds. Tom Breslin contributed $25. Dr. and Mrs. Henderson gave $30. Even Reverend Walsh donated $10 from the church's discretionary fund. One by one, the people who had stood by Elias during his darkest days came forward, and by the end of the week, he had raised nearly $240, enough to cover all the necessary costs with a small buffer remaining. The generosity humbled him. These people owed him nothing, yet they believed in him enough to risk their own limited resources. He vowed silently that when the time came, he would repay every penny with interest. Clayton moved quickly. He filed the mineral claims, hired a surveyor named Robert Chen, who had just arrived from San Francisco, and arranged for proper assay tests to determine the exact composition and value of the meteorite. All of this was done quietly, without fanfare, to avoid attracting attention. But secrets in small towns have a way of slipping out. In early May, just as the surveyor was preparing to visit the Devil's Tooth, Jed Garrett appeared in Clayton's office, his face dark with suspicion. "What's going on with my brother?" Jed demanded. Clayton kept his expression neutral. "I'm not at liberty to discuss my client's private business. He's been coming to town a lot lately, meeting with you, with the Swede, with people who suddenly have money to throw around. What are you all up to?" "Perhaps you should ask Elias directly," Clayton suggested. "I'm asking you," Jed said, leaning across the desk. "And I'm telling you right now, if you're helping him with some scheme to cause trouble for me and Levi, there will be consequences." "Is that a threat, Mr. Garrett?" "It's a promise." After Jed left, Clayton immediately sent a message to Elias. The cat was getting close to being out of the bag. They needed to move faster. Robert Chen arrived at the Devil's Tooth on a bright May morning. He was a slight man with round spectacles and an air of scholarly intensity. He carried specialized equipment, surveying tools, sample collection kits, and notebooks filled with technical diagrams. Buster barked at him suspiciously until Elias called the dog off. "Mr. Garrett," Chen said, shaking Elias's hand. "Mr. Morse tells me you've made an unusual discovery." "That's one way to put it," Elias said, leading him to the fissure. Chen's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened and he dropped to his knees, pulling out a magnifying glass and a small hammer. For the next hour, he chipped samples, took measurements, and made detailed notes. Finally, he stood and brushed off his pants, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Garrett, do you understand what you have here?" Eric Larson said it's meteoric iron. "It's more than that. Much more. This is a massive nickel-iron meteorite, possibly one of the largest intact meteorites in North America. The surface oxidation suggests it's been here for thousands of years, probably since before recorded history. Native peoples might have known about it, might have viewed it as sacred, but they couldn't have extracted it with their technology. How much is it worth?" Chen pulled out his notebook and did some calculations. "That depends on its exact composition and size. I'll need to conduct more thorough tests, but based on what I'm seeing here, if the entire formation is indeed meteoritic in origin, you're looking at thousands of tons of high-grade nickel iron, possibly with platinum and other rare elements in the core." "In dollars," Elias pressed, conservatively, $500,000. Possibly much more if there are significant quantities of platinum or other rare elements. Elias had to sit down. $500,000. It was an incomprehensible sum, more money than he had ever imagined existing in one place. His brothers had fought over 1,200 acres of grazing land, worth maybe $50,000. Meanwhile, he had been sitting on top of a fortune 50 times greater. "What do I do now?" Elias asked. "You continue with the legal process, file your claims, get proper documentation, and then approach mining companies about extraction rights. But be careful, Mr. Garrett. Once word gets out about this, you'll have every opportunist and swindler in Montana trying to separate you from your property." "And my brothers?" Chen adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Morse mentioned your family situation. I'll be frank with you. Your brothers will almost certainly challenge your ownership once they learn what you've discovered. They'll claim your father was incompetent when he wrote the will, or that he didn't know what he was leaving you, or any number of other arguments. But Mr. Morse assures me your claim is solid. You just need to hold on until the legal process is complete." After Chen left, Elias sat atop his shack, looking out over the valley. From up here, he could see his brother's ranch in the distance, see the cattle grazing on land that had once been his father's. Soon, everything would change. Soon, he would have the means to stand up to Levi and Jed, to repay all the people who had helped him, to build something lasting and meaningful. But first, he had to survive whatever his brothers would throw at him when they finally learned the truth. And that truth, he knew, would not remain hidden much longer. That night, Elias dreamed of his father. In the dream, Samuel was standing beside the devil's tooth, one weathered hand resting on the stone. He was smiling, something Elias remembered from his childhood but had rarely seen in his father's later years. "You understand now," Samuel said in the dream. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Elias asked. "Because you had to find it yourself. You had to choose to stay, to endure, to believe in something you couldn't see. That's what makes it yours, Elias. Not the metal, not the money. The choice to stay when everything told you to leave. That's the real treasure." When Elias woke, his face was wet with tears. He wiped them away and looked down at Buster, who was watching him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. "You knew too, didn't you, boy?" Elias said softly. "You knew what we were sitting on all along." Buster thumped his tail once against the floor, and in that simple gesture, Elias felt a connection to something larger than himself. To his father's wisdom, to the patience of stone, to the faith that things hidden would eventually be revealed. The devil's tooth had tested him, had forced him to prove his worth not through strength or cunning, but through simple endurance and trust. And now, finally, He had passed that test. The secret lasted exactly 4 more days. On a Tuesday morning, as Elias was repairing a section of fence for Tom Breslin, a rider came galloping up the trail in a cloud of dust. It was Eric Larson's apprentice, a young man named Peter, and his face was pale with urgency. "Mr. Garrett," he gasped, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "You need to come quick. Your brothers are at the Devil's Tooth with a sheriff and a lawyer from Helena." Elias dropped his tools and ran for Rosie. Tom followed, grabbing his own horse. They rode hard, covering the distance to the Devil's Tooth in half the usual time. As they crested the final rise, Elias saw what he had feared. A dozen men gathered around the base of the rock, including Sheriff Morgan, a heavy-set man in a dark suit who must be the lawyer, and his brothers, both looking triumphant. Elias dismounted and walked forward, Buster at his heels. "What's going on here?" Levi turned, and his smile was like a knife blade. "What's going on is that we've come to reclaim our property." "This is my property," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fear clutching at his chest. "Pa left it to me." "That's what we need to discuss," the lawyer said, stepping forward. "I'm Harold Pemberton, representing Levi and Jed Garrett. We've discovered some irregularities in your father's will." "There are no irregularities," Elias said. "Clayton Morse drafted it himself." "Be that as it may," Pemberton said smoothly, "my clients have reason to believe your father was not of sound mind when he signed the document. They filed a challenge with the territorial court." "On what grounds?" Tom demanded, moving to stand beside Elias. "On the grounds that Samuel Garrett's final wishes were clearly not rational," Jed said. "What sane man leaves his eldest son's prime grazing land and his youngest nothing but a worthless rock? Unless," he paused dramatically, "unless the man was already losing his faculties." "Your father was dying," Pemberton continued, "in considerable pain, taking laudanum regularly for the discomfort. It's well documented that such medications can affect judgment and mental clarity. My clients believe that in his diminished state, Samuel made a grave error. They're asking the court to set aside the will and distribute the estate equally among all 3 sons. "Including this property," Levi added, gesturing at the Devil's Tooth. Elias felt rage building in his chest. "You knew this land was valuable. That's why you're doing this." "Valuable?" Jed laughed. "It's a pile of rock." "Then why do you want it?" "Because it's wrong," Levi said, his voice hardening. "Wrong that you got anything at all while we did all the work. Pa was out of his mind, and everyone knows it. The court will see that." Sheriff Morgan, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Mr. Garrett, Elias, I'm afraid I have to serve you with this." He handed over a folded document. "It's a temporary injunction. Until the court settles the will dispute, you're forbidden from selling, leasing, or extracting any resources from this property." "You can't do that," Elias said, but even as he spoke, he knew they could. They were doing it. "We can and we have," Pemberton said. "Any violation of this injunction will result in immediate arrest and forfeiture of all claims. Is that clear?" Tom put a hand on Elias's arm, silently counseling patience. Elias forced himself to nod. "Good," Pemberton said. "We'll be in touch regarding the court date. In the meantime, you may continue to reside here, but any commercial activity is strictly prohibited." After they left, Elias stood staring at the paper in his hands, feeling everything he had gained slipping away. Tom, Eric, and Clayton had all warned him this might happen, but knowing it was possible and experiencing it were 2 different things. "We'll fight this," Tom said. "Clayton will know what to do." But when they met with Clayton later that afternoon, the lawyer's face was grave. "They've found a weak spot. The laudanum angle is actually fairly strong. I have records showing that Dr. Henderson prescribed it regularly during Samuel's final months. Pemberton will argue that Samuel was under the influence when he signed the will, that his judgment was impaired." "But you witnessed it," Elias said. "You saw him." "Was he impaired?" "No," Clayton admitted. He was in pain, yes, but his mind was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing, but proving that to a judge is another matter entirely. And there's something else you should know. He pulled out a telegram from his desk drawer. I received this morning. It's from the Territorial Mining Office. Someone has filed a counterclaim on your mineral rights. Who? The filing is anonymous, routed through a lawyer in Butte, but we all know who's behind it. Your brothers are covering every angle. Even if you win the will dispute, they're trying to separate the mineral rights from the land ownership. Can they do that? It's complicated. In theory, mineral rights transfer with the land, unless specifically separated. But if they can prove that Samuel didn't know the Devil's Tooth contained valuable minerals when he wrote the will, they might argue that he couldn't have intended to give you the mineral rights. It's a long shot, but in the hands of a good lawyer, long shots sometimes connect. Elias felt the walls closing in. His brothers were not just greedy, they were thorough. They had anticipated his moves and countered them at every turn. What do I do? We gather evidence, Clayton said. We find people who will testify to Samuel's mental clarity. We document everything about the will's creation, and we pray that the judge sees through your brother's scheme. How long will this take? Months, maybe longer. The territorial courts are backed up, and your brothers will delay as much as possible. In the meantime, you're stuck. You can't develop the property, can't sell it, can't do anything but wait. That night, as Elias sat in his shack, he felt the bitter irony of his situation. He'd gone from having nothing to having everything to having nothing again, all in the space of a few months. The meteorite was still there, still valuable, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did him now. He was not defeated, though. Not yet. His brothers had money and lawyers, but Elias had something they did not. He had truth on his side, and he had people who believed in him. The fight would be long and hard, but he would not surrender. The Devil's Tooth had tested him once already, and he had proven himself worthy. This was just another test, another trial to endure. But late that night, as he was drifting off to sleep, Buster suddenly began barking furiously. Elias bolted awake and grabbed the rifle he kept beside his bed. He moved to the small window and looked down. In the moonlight, he could see 3 figures moving around the base of the rock. They were working quickly, digging at the exposed fissure where the meteorite lay revealed. Even from this distance, Elias recognized them. Ranch hands from his brother's property, here to steal samples of the meteorite under cover of darkness. Rage surged through him. They were not content to tie him up in court. They were going to steal what they could not legally claim. Elias grabbed his rope ladder and descended as quickly as he dared, Buster scrambling down beside him. "Stop right there," Elias shouted, raising his rifle. The 3 men froze, then slowly turned. One of them, a hard-looking character named Gage that Elias knew by reputation, put his hands up in mock surrender. "Easy there, Elias. We're just following orders. Your brothers want some samples analyzed. Make sure you're not running some kind of scam." "This is my property. You're trespassing." "Actually," Gage said, pulling a paper from his pocket, "according to this here injunction, this property is in dispute, which means we got as much right to be here as you do." "That's not what it means, and you know it." "Well, that's between lawyers to figure out. Right now, we're just doing our job." Gage nodded to his companions, and they went back to digging. Elias pointed his rifle at the ground near Gage's feet and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley, and all 3 men jumped back, hands reaching for their own weapons. "The next one won't be a warning," Elias said, his voice cold and level. "Get off my property. Now." For a tense moment, the men stared at him, weighing their options. Then Gage spat in the dirt and motioned to his companions. "Come on. We'll come back with the sheriff. Let him try that again when there's witnesses." They rode off into the darkness, leaving Elias standing alone with his rifle and his dog. His hands were shaking, and he realized that he had just crossed a line. He had used violence, or the threat of it, to defend what was his. It was necessary, but it changed things. The conflict with his brothers had just escalated from legal maneuvering to something more dangerous, something that could end in blood if it was not careful. Managed. The next morning, Sheriff Morgan arrived at the Devil's Tooth with Gage and his 2 companions in tow. The lawman looked tired and unhappy, like a man caught between duty and friendship. He had known Samuel Garrett, had respected him, and Elias could see the conflict in his eyes as he dismounted. "Elias," the sheriff said heavily, "these men say you threatened them with a firearm last night. They were trespassing on my property, trying to steal samples of the meteorite." "We were conducting a legal survey," Gage said, "following orders from Mr. Levi Garrett, who has a rightful claim to this property pending the court's decision." "Is that true, Sheriff?" Elias asked. "Does the injunction give them the right to come onto my land without permission?" Morgan pulled out the legal document and read it carefully. After a long moment, he shook his head. "No. The injunction prevents you from commercial exploitation of the property, but it doesn't grant your brothers or their representatives the right to trespass. That said, Elias, you can't go shooting at people, even if they're in the wrong." "I shot at the ground," Elias said. "Warning shot. They left peacefully after that. Next time, you fetch me instead of taking matters into your own hands. Understood?" "Yes, sir." After the sheriff and the ranch hands left, Elias felt a small measure of victory. He had defended his property and been vindicated, at least for now, but he knew this was far from over. His brothers would try again, using different tactics, different approaches. They would not stop until they had what they wanted, or until Elias found a way to defeat them decisively. Over the following weeks, Elias threw himself into preparing for the court battle. Clayton gathered depositions from everyone who had witnessed Samuel's final days. Dr. Henderson, Martha, Reverend Walsh, even some of the ranch hands who had worked for the old man. All of them testified to Samuel's mental clarity, his deliberate decision-making, his explicit statements about what he wanted his sons to have. But Pemberton countered with his own witnesses, doctors who testified about the effects of laudanum, experts who questioned whether a dying man could make rational decisions, and most damningly, neighbors who admitted that Samuel's final will seemed strange, even inexplicable. Why would a father give his best land to his worst sons, and his worst land to his best son? It made no sense, they said, unless the old man's mind had been failing. The court date was set for mid-July. As the weeks passed, Elias felt the weight of anticipation building. Everything hinged on a judge's decision, his future, his vindication, his ability to repay the people who had helped him. The meteorite remained there, tantalizingly close but legally untouchable. Sometimes Elias would stand at the edge of his property and look at it, thinking about how a fortune could be worthless if you could not access it. Tom Breslin visited regularly, bringing news from town and words of encouragement. "People are watching this case closely," Tom told him one afternoon as they sat outside the shack. "Your brothers have made a lot of enemies over the years. Folks are hoping you win, if only to see Levi and Jed taken down a notch." "What if I lose?" Elias asked quietly. "Then we'll figure something else out. But you're not going to lose. Truth has a way of coming out eventually." "I used to believe that," Elias said. "Now I'm not so sure." The day before the court hearing, Clayton came out to the Devil's Tooth with troubling news. Pemberton has filed a last-minute motion. He's claiming that even if the will is upheld, the mineral rights should be separated from the land and divided equally among all 3 brothers. He's arguing that your father couldn't have known about the meteorite, so he couldn't have intended to give you exclusive rights to it. "That's insane," Elias said. "The land includes everything on it and under it. I know, and I've filed a counter-motion. But there's precedent for this kind of thing in mining disputes. If the judge is sympathetic to your brothers, he could split the decision, uphold the will but redistribute the mineral rights. You'd keep the land, but they'd get a share of the profits." which means I'd be tied to them forever. Every decision about the meteorite would have to go through all three of us. Exactly. And knowing your brothers, they'd make every decision as difficult as possible. Elias sat down heavily on a rock, feeling defeated. So, even if I win, I lose. Not necessarily, but you need to be prepared for that possibility. That night, Elias could not sleep. He lay in his shack, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible outcome in his mind. In the best case, the judge upheld the will completely, and Elias gained full control of the meteorite. In the worst case, the will was invalidated, and the estate was split equally, giving his brothers 2/3 of everything, including most of the meteorite. In between were a dozen variations, most of them bad for Elias. He thought about his father, about Samuel's choice to give him this land. It had seemed like a cruel joke at first, a final insult from a dying man, but Elias understood now that it had been a test. His father had wanted to see which son would stay, which would persevere, which would prove himself worthy. Samuel had known about the meteorite. He must have known. That was why he had given it to Elias specifically. Not because Elias deserved less, but because he deserved the opportunity to prove his worth. But what if the court did not see it that way? What if all Samuel's careful planning came to nothing because of legal technicalities and clever lawyers? As dawn broke, Elias made a decision. Win or lose, he would not let this destroy him. He would fight with everything he had, but if he lost, he would accept it and move on. There was more to life than winning, more to manhood than wealth. His father had taught him that through example, showing him how to endure hardship with dignity, how to face injustice without becoming bitter. Elias would honor that lesson, whatever the outcome. He rode into Three Forks that morning with Tom and Clayton. The courthouse was a modest building, but it was packed with spectators. Word had spread about the Garrett-Will dispute, and it seemed like half the valley had turned out to watch. Elias saw Martha Henderson in the crowd, and Dr. Henderson, and Eric Larson, and Reverend Walsh, and dozens of others who had helped him through the worst months of his life. Their presence gave him strength. His brothers sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with their lawyer. Levi looked confident, even smug. Jed kept his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed with anticipation. Between them sat Harold Pemberton, organizing his papers with practiced efficiency. Judge Martin Blackwood entered, and everyone stood. Blackwood was an old man, maybe 70, with white hair and keen blue eyes. He had been a territorial judge for nearly 30 years and had a reputation for fairness tempered with practicality. He would not be easily swayed by emotion or theatrics. The proceedings began with opening statements. Pemberton laid out his case with smooth confidence, painting a picture of a dying man, addled by pain and medication, making irrational decisions that needed to be corrected by the court. He had medical testimony, expert opinions, and witnesses who would attest to Samuel's diminished capacity. Clayton countered by presenting Samuel as a man who, even in death, remained clear-minded and purposeful. He had a lifetime of sound decisions behind him, and his final will was consistent with his character. Unconventional, perhaps, but not irrational. Clayton argued that Samuel had deliberately chosen to test his sons, to give each what they needed rather than what they wanted. The testimony lasted all morning. Dr. Henderson took the stand and acknowledged that yes, Samuel had been on laudanum, but the doses were carefully controlled, and he had remained lucid and coherent until the very end. Pemberton cross-examined aggressively, trying to introduce doubt, but the doctor held firm. Martha Henderson testified next, describing her many conversations with Samuel during his illness. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she said firmly. "He told me once that he was worried about Levi and Jed, worried that they cared more about the ranch than about family. He wanted to teach them a lesson." "And what lesson was that?" Clayton asked. "That worth isn't measured in acres, Martha said, looking directly at Levi and Jed. That character matters more than wealth. The afternoon brought more testimony, including several neighbors who admitted under cross-examination that they had thought Samuel's will was strange. But when Clayton pressed them, they also admitted that Samuel had always been unconventional, had always marched to his own drummer. Strange, yes, but consistent with who he had been in life. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, it was Elias's turn to testify. He walked to the witness stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on him. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Clayton started with gentle questions, establishing Elias's relationship with his father, his role on the ranch, his character as a man. Then came the harder questions about the devil's tooth, about why he had stayed there when most men would have left, about what he had discovered. When Elias described finding the meteorite, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "And you believe your father knew about this meteorite?" Clayton asked. "I do," Elias said. "I think he knew it was there, knew it was valuable. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one who would stay long enough to find it. My brothers would have sold the land immediately, never knowing what they had. Pa wanted to teach us all something, teach them that greed has consequences, and teach me that faith and patience have rewards." Pemberton's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked every aspect of Elias's testimony, trying to make him admit that Samuel could not have known about the meteorite, that the whole thing was coincidence, that Elias was just lucky. But Elias held firm. "My father was a lot of things, but he was never foolish. He knew this land better than anyone. If there was something valuable here, he knew about it." As court adjourned for the day, Elias felt exhausted but oddly peaceful. He had told his truth. Now it was up to the judge to decide what to do with it. The second day of the hearing brought closing arguments. Pemberton went first, and he was masterful. He spoke of family obligation, of how Samuel's irrational favoritism had torn his sons apart. He painted Levi and Jed as victims of their father's failing mind, honest men who deserved their fair share. He argued that to uphold such an obviously flawed will would be a mockery of justice. "The law exists to protect people from their own diminished capacity," Pemberton concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. "Samuel Garrett, God rest his soul, was not in his right mind when he signed this will. The court has a duty, a moral duty, to correct his error and distribute his estate fairly among his sons." Clayton stood for his closing argument, and the courtroom fell silent. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, but his words carried weight. "My opponent speaks of fairness, of equity, of correcting errors. But whose error are we correcting? Samuel Garrett made his choices with open eyes and a clear mind. He knew his sons, he knew their characters, their strengths, their weaknesses, and he made a decision that reflected that knowledge." Clayton walked to where the meteorite sample sat on the evidence table. He picked it up, holding it so the light caught its metallic surface. This is what this case is really about, not fairness, not a dying man's confused thoughts. This is about greed. When Samuel Garrett died, his eldest sons believed they had won. They had the best land, the most cattle, the greatest inheritance, and they were content to let their youngest brother live in poverty on a worthless rock. But now that rock has turned out to be valuable, more valuable than everything else combined, and suddenly they want to rewrite history. They want to claim that their father didn't mean what he clearly meant. He set the meteorite down and turned to face Levi and Jed directly. Samuel Garrett left his youngest son a test. He left him something that appeared worthless but contained great value, and he wanted to see if Elias would have the faith and courage to discover that value. Well, Elias passed that test. He stayed when he could have left. He endured when he could have given up. He proved himself worthy of his father's trust, and now his brothers, who failed their own test by abandoning family for profit, Want to steal what Elias has earned." Clayton returned to his table and stood beside Elias. "Your Honor, this case is not complicated. A man wrote a will. That will was properly witnessed and notarized. The man who wrote it was of sound mind, as multiple credible witnesses have testified. The will should be upheld exactly as written. To do otherwise would be to reward greed and punish perseverance. It would send a message that character doesn't matter, that endurance counts for nothing, that the strong can always take from the weak if they have better lawyers." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Don't let them do that, Your Honor. Uphold Samuel Garrett's will. Let his final wishes stand, and let his youngest son keep what he has earned through faith and hard work." Judge Blackwood sat silently for a long moment after Clayton finished. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. "I've heard enough. I'm prepared to rule." A rustle went through the courtroom. Elias felt his heart hammering in his chest. Beside him, Clayton tensed. "I've been a judge for a long time," Blackwood continued. "I've seen a lot of wills, heard a lot of disputes, and I've learned to tell the difference between a document written by someone who didn't know what they were doing and a document written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." He looked directly at Levi and Jed. Samuel Garrett knew what he was doing. Every witness who knew him well has testified to that. Yes, he was dying. Yes, he was in pain. Yes, he took medication for that pain. But none of that affected his mental clarity or his right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. Pemberton started to stand, but the judge waved him down. "As for the argument that Samuel couldn't have known about the meteorite, I find that unconvincing. Samuel Garrett worked that land for nearly 50 years. He knew every rock, every stream, every acre. Is it so hard to believe that he knew what the devil's tooth really was? I don't think so." The judge picked up his gavel. "The will of Samuel Garrett is hereby upheld in its entirety. Elias Garrett is the sole and rightful owner of the property known as the Devil's Tooth, including all mineral rights and any resources contained therein. The temporary injunction is lifted. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the stunned silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the courtroom erupted in noise. Cheers from Elias's supporters, angry protests from Levi and Jed, the murmur of 100 conversations starting at once. Elias sat frozen, unable to quite believe what he had just heard. He had won. Against all odds, against his brother's money and lawyers and schemes, he had won. The Devil's Tooth was his, completely and legally his. The meteorite was his. The future was his. Clayton gripped his shoulder, grinning. "You did it, son. You actually did it." Tom Breslin pushed through the crowd to shake his hand, followed by the Hendersons, Eric Larson, and dozens of others. They surrounded him, offering congratulations and support, creating a warm bubble of celebration that pushed back against the cold fury radiating from where his brothers stood. Elias looked across the courtroom and met Levi's eyes. The hatred there was pure and undisguised. This was not over, those eyes said. The court might have ruled against them, but Levi and Jed were not the kind of men to accept defeat gracefully. But for now, in this moment, Elias allowed himself to feel the full weight of his victory. He had stood his ground, he had trusted in justice, and he had won. The celebration at the Henderson house that evening was subdued but genuine. A small group gathered. Tom, Clayton, Eric, the Hendersons, Reverend Walsh, and a few others who had supported Elias through his darkest days. They shared a meal and offered toasts to justice served and perseverance rewarded. But Elias found it hard to fully join in the festivities. He kept thinking about his brothers' faces in the courtroom, about the promise of retribution he had seen in their eyes. Legal defeat would not be the end of this, he was certain. Levi and Jed would find other ways to strike back. His concerns proved justified sooner than he expected. 3 days after the court ruling, as Elias was meeting with representatives from the Montana Mining Consortium about extraction rights for the meteorite, Sheriff Morgan arrived at the Devil's Tooth with troubling news. "Your brothers filed a federal claim this morning," the sheriff said, looking apologetic. "They're arguing that the meteorite is a natural treasure of scientific importance and should be protected as a national monument. They've petitioned the territorial governor to seize it under eminent domain." Elias felt his stomach drop. Can they do that? It's a long shot, but it's possible. If the governor agrees that the meteorite has significant scientific value, he could order it preserved rather than mined. You'd keep ownership of the land, but you couldn't extract anything from it. In other words, I'd have a fortune I can't touch. That's about the size of it. Clayton, when informed of this new development, was furious. They're grasping at straws. The meteorite is private property, clearly established by the court. The governor has no grounds to seize it. "But he might try anyway," Elias said. "If my brothers convince him it's in the public interest, then we fight it. Again. We keep fighting until they run out of money or tricks, whichever comes first." But Elias was tired of fighting, tired of lawsuits and injunctions and legal maneuvering. He had won in court, but his victory felt hollow when every day brought a new challenge, a new attempt to separate him from what was rightfully his. There had to be another way, a way to end this conflict decisively and permanently. The answer came to him that night as he sat atop the Devil's Tooth, looking out over the valley. His brothers wanted the meteorite for the money it represented. They wanted to profit from something they had never valued, had never worked for, and they would keep attacking him, keep finding new angles and strategies until they either succeeded or destroyed him in the attempt. So he would take away their motivation. He would make a deal that gave them nothing. The next morning, Elias rode to his brother's ranch. Levi and Jed met him in the yard, their faces hard with suspicion. "What do you want?" Levi demanded. "To make you an offer," Elias said calmly. "I know about your petition to the governor. I know you're trying to get the meteorite declared a monument, but we both know that's not going to work. The court ruling was clear. The property is mine." "We'll see about that," Jed said. "Yes, we will. And in the meantime, while you're wasting money on lawyers and petitions, I'll be negotiating with mining companies. I've already had offers. Good offers. Within a month, I'll have a contract signed and extraction will begin. Once that happens, your legal challenges become meaningless. Can't put the ore back in the ground once it's been mined." Levi's face darkened. "You threatening us?" "I'm stating facts. But here's my offer. I'll buy this ranch from you, both of you. I'll pay fair market value. More than fair, actually. $50,000 for your combined holdings. That's twice what you could get from anyone else, and you know it." "Why would you do that?" Jed asked, his eyes narrowed. "Because I want you gone," Elias said simply. "I want you out of this valley, away from me and away from people I care about. Take the money, go somewhere else, start over. Or don't, and watch while I become the wealthiest man in Montana while you're stuck here, bitter and resentful, knowing you could have had something but threw it away out of pride." The brothers exchanged glances. Elias could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of options. $50,000 was real money, more than they would see from their failing ranch in a decade. But accepting it meant admitting defeat, meant acknowledging that their youngest brother had beaten them. "We need time to think about it," Levi said finally. "You have 48 hours, Elias said. "After that, the offer expires, and you get nothing but the satisfaction of knowing you fought to the bitter end." He rode away without waiting for a response. He had made his play. Now it was up to them. 2 days later, Clayton received a letter from Pemberton. Levi and Jed accepted the offer with one condition: the transaction would be private, with no public announcement. They wanted to save face, wanted to leave town without everyone knowing they had sold out to their younger brother. Elias agreed. He did not need public vindication. He just needed them gone. The sale closed 3 weeks later. Elias, now the owner of his father's entire original ranch plus the Devil's Tooth, stood in the yard of the main house and looked around. This was where he had grown up, where he had learned to work cattle and mend fence and survive harsh Montana winters. It should have been his all along, or at least part of it, but his father had known better. Samuel had known that his eldest sons needed to lose everything before they could learn anything, and Elias needed to earn everything before he could appreciate anything. Now finally, the lessons were learned. The tests were passed, and the Garrett legacy belonged to the one son who had proven himself worthy of it. 6 months later, Elias stood at the base of the Devil's Tooth and watched the mining crew prepare for the first extraction. The Montana Mining Consortium had brought in experts from as far away as Germany and Sweden, men who knew how to handle meteoric iron, how to preserve its unique properties while extracting the valuable elements within. The operation would take years, they told him, and would yield riches beyond imagining. But Elias had already received the first payment, enough money to transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who had helped him. He had repaid every loan with generous interest. He had donated to the church, to the school, to the town itself. Dr. and Mrs. Henderson received a new medical clinic. Eric Larson got a modern forge with equipment from back east. Tom Breslin found his mortgage mysteriously paid in full. The ranch itself was being transformed. Elias hired good men to run it properly, treating the land with respect rather than just as a source of profit. He expanded the operation, but carefully, sustainably. He built new housing for the workers, paid fair wages, and created a place where men wanted to work rather than a place they had to work. And he kept the Devil's Tooth itself largely untouched. The mining operation was careful and limited, extracting the meteorite in a way that preserved as much of the formation as possible for scientific study. Robert Chen, the surveyor, had his wish. The site would become a landmark, a place where people could come to see a piece of the cosmos that had fallen to Earth millennia ago. But the greatest change was not in the land or the money. It was in Elias himself. The man who had once sat alone in a crude shack, wondering if he had been forgotten by the world, now walked with quiet confidence. He had learned that worth was not given, but earned, that true wealth was measured not in acres or dollars, but in character and perseverance. On a crisp autumn morning, as the first snow dusted the peaks above the valley, Elias received an unexpected visitor. A young man in his early 20s rode up to the ranch house, nervously dismounting and asking to speak with Mr. Garrett. The ranch foreman brought him to Elias, who was working in the stable, his hands still stained with honest labor despite his new wealth. "Mr. Garrett," the young man said, "my name is Thomas Brennan. I'm from over in Billings. I heard about your story, about how you held on to your land when everyone said it was worthless, about how you stood up to your brothers and won." "News travels," Elias said, continuing to work on the saddle he was mending. "What can I do for you, Thomas?" "My father died 6 months ago. Left me a small piece of property, maybe 5 acres up in the hills. Everyone says it's worthless, that I should sell it and use the money to go to college. But I don't know. I keep thinking there must be a reason Pa left it to me specifically. And then I heard about you, and I thought maybe you'd understand." Elias set down his tools and looked at the young man carefully. He saw in Thomas's face the same uncertainty, the same hope and fear that he himself had felt not so long ago. "What do you want me to tell you?" Elias asked gently. "I want to know if I should hold on to it, if I should believe there's something more there than what everyone else sees." Elias thought about his answer for a long moment. He thought about his father's strange gift, about the months of hardship and loneliness, about Buster digging at the rock until his paws bled. He thought about faith and perseverance, about the difference between giving up and holding on. "I can't tell you what to do," he said finally. "Every piece of land is different. Every father is different, but I can tell you this. If your father was a good man, if he loved you and wanted the best for you, then he had a reason for what he did. Maybe that land is valuable. Maybe it's not. But maybe the real value isn't in the land itself. Maybe it's in you learning whether you're the kind of man who holds on to things when times get hard or the kind who lets go at the first sign of trouble. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. You think I should keep it? I think you should decide for yourself, but whatever you decide, make sure it's your choice, not someone else's. And if you choose to hold on, be prepared for it to be difficult. Worth isn't usually easy to find. After the young man left, Elias walked to the pasture where Rosie grazed peacefully. Buster trotted beside him, older now, but still loyal, still alert. The dog looked up at his master with those knowing eyes, and Elias reached down to scratch behind his ears. You knew all along, didn't you, boy? You knew what we were sitting on. Buster wagged his tail, accepting the praise as his due. That evening, as Elias sat on the porch of the main house, his house now, watching the sun set over the valley, he thought about his father. Samuel had been gone for over a year, but his presence still lingered in the land, in the choices he had made, in the lessons he had taught through action rather than words. The devil's tooth rose in the distance, dark against the fading light. It looked just as it always had from here, an odd imposing rock formation dominating the northern pastures. To most eyes, it still looked worthless. But Elias knew better. He knew that sometimes the things that appear most valueless hold the greatest treasure. And sometimes the hardest tests lead to the most meaningful rewards. He had learned what his father wanted him to learn. He had proven what his father knew he could prove. And in doing so, he had become the man his father had hoped he would be. Not because of wealth or land or victory over his brothers, but because he had chosen faith over despair, perseverance over surrender, and hope over bitterness. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Buster settled at Elias's feet with a contented sigh, and Elias Garrett, who had once owned nothing but a worthless rock and a faithful dog, now owned something far more valuable, a life built on tested character and earned dignity. That, he realized, was the real inheritance his father had left him. The devil's tooth had just been the test, and he had passed.